Good morning, everyone. Here, let me get on screen. Again, I'm David Weiss with the Better Business Bureau. I want to welcome you to our BBB Flash webinar series. The idea is to get you great information quickly. So let me very quickly introduce our presenter for this morning. Very interesting gentleman who was for 18 years an attorney with Hahn Lozier, where he was chair of the Labor and Employment Department of that very prestigious law firm. Then moved over to become the new general counsel at North Coast Container Corporation, a very respected local company. He's also a member of our board of directors and one of the very outstanding board of directors we have here at the Better Business Bureau. So let me introduce Jim Drozdowski.
Thank you, David. Let's see if we can get myself up on screen. There I am. All right. Just by way of further introduction, and the reason why I'm hopefully relevant to this topic today, I was also the hiring partner for many years at Hahn Lozier & Parks, and that is a big part of my function with my new position at North Coast Container. And for all of those of you that are watching this today, I know that you know what it's like to go through an interviewing process, how time-consuming it is, how expensive it is, and how important it is to get it right the first time, because you don't want to do it twice if you can all avoid it. Please, I know that we're doing this in a webinar format, but if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to jump into the conversation. And your question, if you type it out, will appear on my screen so that I can take a look at it. I'll read it back to the group so that everybody can be on the same page, and I'll do my best to answer as I go. All right. So let's see if I can get started with my slides. All right. And there we go. All right. Let's remember as we go through this process, why do we interview in the first place? The first thing that you're doing is you're judging qualifications. You're testing those qualifications. It's important to obviously review the resume, the job application, and really challenge some of the things that people write on there. We know that when we see a resume, there's definitely some level of puffery and salesmanship that goes into it. The interview is a time for you to really test those statements and see how real they really are. And this is another important part about why we interview. We interview to determine fit. This is not something that you can see on a page, right? This is something that you can only determine by sitting down with somebody, and you look across the table at somebody and you say to yourself, can I see myself working with this person 8 to 10 hours a day? Is this someone who's going to be a functioning part of our culture? You're looking for cultural fit. You're looking for personality fit. And whether or not you think they can be an effective member of your team. This is also important, setting expectations for the position. If you get to this point in the interview where you're starting to move into sales mode, you want to make sure that you are very clear about the things that you expect out of this person. In my prior life at Hahn Lozier & Parks, for 18 years I litigated these cases, and I can tell you in many cases I used to see situations where statements that were made in an interview 5 years prior, 10 years prior, came back to haunt somebody because that person received an expectation that maybe didn't live up to be what it was when the position was actually put forward. And then the fourth part about this is, if you really like somebody, you're in a position where you're doing a sales job, right? So be prepared to sell your company if it's somebody that you really like. Now, understanding that those are sort of the four basic reasons why we interview. Judging qualifications, challenging those assumptions in the resume, determining some personality and cultural fit, setting expectations, and selling the position. You've got to remember one basic thing. An interview is unlike any other conversation that you can think of. It's not a casual conversation between you and your spouse or you and your friends or even you and your work colleagues. It's a protected conversation. It's a protected conversation because while on the one hand we are gathering information from this person, we are also entering into a position where they have legally protected rights. And here's the basic premise, and Bridget, if you can put this one up full screen just so everybody can read it. It's a mouthful, but this is the basic premise. Applicants, anybody who comes in your door, anybody who you take a look at through monster.com, or either if they come through the door or even if they don't, anybody who throws their hat in the ring to come work for you have to be considered solely on the basis of their qualifications and their likelihood of success, without regard to the color of their skin, their sex, their national origin, disability, age, religion, other protected characteristics. What are other protected characteristics? Things like, for example, sexual orientation. If you are operating within the city of Cleveland, there's a city ordinance that deals with that. We know that the world is changing and moving more in the direction of protecting that, probably more globally. Things like veteran status, whether somebody serves in the military or if they served prior, at a prior time in the military. There are other characteristics. You have a sense of what they are. If you have any questions about that, please do let me know. Oh, yes, please. Yeah, you can go back. Let's go back to the smaller screen. And let me give you an example of places where you should not go. If I can get, can't move forward here. That one. That's not moving forward. Here. Things to avoid when you're talking to an applicant. When and where you were born. These are things that you can imagine talking to somebody about in a casual conversation. You might want to find out where somebody was from. That's an interesting last name, Mr. Drozdowski. Is that a Polish last name? You can see that coming up. In casual conversation, that happens. And yet, in an interview setting, we can run ourselves into trouble because if I don't get that position, if I'm not the guy that was chosen, I may decide that that was an unfair decision. And if I think it's unfair, it's possible that I'm going to start connecting dots in ways that maybe they shouldn't be connected, but people do it all the time. Again, in my experience as an attorney, I can tell you that that person may walk out of that interview and say, you know, I thought that interview was just going great until I happened to mention the fact that I was born in Poland. And all of a sudden, everything turned, and when even though I thought I was the best candidate out there, he apparently doesn't like the Polish guys. So what you've got to do is try to avoid those conversations. Marital status. Again, in casual conversation with friends, in casual conversation with colleagues, this is something that comes up. It should not come up in a job interview. Where your parents or your grandparents came from. Remember, ethnicity, national origin, these are protected categories. These are not things you should be asking about. Questions you would ask of one gender but not the other. What do I mean by that? Think about a question like this. Would it be appropriate to ask in an interview what the applicant's plans are for having a family? Here's the problem with asking a question like that. You can ask that question of a man, and you might get an answer that says that the man, his wife is pregnant and they already have 2 children. Ask that question of a woman. Get the exact same answer. I have 2 kids and I'm pregnant with our 3rd. 2 questions asked of 2 different candidates, the exact same answer given, and yet we come to a different conclusion about that person's suitability for the position, don't we? We do that on a stereotypical basis. Because between those 2 candidates, on a stereotypical basis, who am I more likely to hire, the man or the woman? I think it's pretty clear in a situation like this that our stereotypes start to come into play. And we start to think, if I hire the woman, I've got to start worrying about daycare, and I've got to worry about pregnancy, and I've got to worry about leave, and I've got to worry about when the kid has a runny nose, she's going to be the one that goes home. Because on a stereotypical basis, the woman is the one that takes care of the kids, right? And then again, on a stereotypical basis, the man is the breadwinner. And in fact, I might love the fact that he has 2 kids and has another on, along the way, because I know I'm going to be able to get every last hour of his week out of him. We don't ask questions like that because we end up coming to unfair assumptions about people, because as you sit there in a 30-minute interview, it's really unfair to try to come to a conclusion about somebody and whether, you know, how their own personal family situation is going to come into play. Medical conditions. We don't ask about medical conditions during an interview process. Now be careful here. There is an exception to that. Post-hiring, after you make an offer, you are allowed to do exams of folks. If you have a position that requires heavy lifting, if you have a construction business, for example, you can do functional capacity exams. They're called fitness for duty tests, and some of you may be familiar with those. Those are okay, but you have to do that after the interview process. Citizenship. We're not allowed to ask about that. Any question that would reveal arrests without convictions. We're allowed to ask about convictions, and probably many of you on your job applications, I know we do at North Coast Container, we do ask about convictions. It's okay to ask about convictions, but not about arrests. Innocent till proven guilty, essentially. And in a situation where there are convictions, you may know this, you may have read about this, the EEOC, the federal government, is taking a pretty aggressive approach on this. You can't have a bright line litmus test that says if you have a conviction, you can't work here. The EEOC wants us to do our homework on each of those convictions, look at each one of them individually on a case-by-case basis. And so if you have somebody who comes to you with a felony conviction that's 10 years old, look at what the felony was for. Is it for a violent crime? If you have a driving position, was this a DUI? Is this something that he did when he was a kid, and everything that you can see from the next 10 years looks like he's reformed himself? Those are questions you ask yourself. Judgment calls that you have to make, but you have to make them on a case-by-case basis. You can't just have a bright line. Native language. These are things that are sort of do not go there type questions. Where else is it important not to go? Well, a key thing that I see often, and I used to see this all the time when I litigated these cases, are promises that are made during interviews. You know, most of your employees, if you're like North Coast Container or Honloger and Parks before it, probably most of your employees are at will. And I suspect that many of you know what that means. It basically means that you are there at your own free will. You can be fired for any reason or no reason at all. I can give you notice. I don't have to give you notice. You're free to quit at any time with or without notice. And that's the way that most positions are created. But every now and then, we make promises in interviews. And those promises come back to haunt us because those promises can turn into a binding contract. And how do we get there? Well, we get there when we go beyond this point. It's okay to clarify expectations about productivity and attendance and so on. Remember, setting expectations is key when you're doing something like this. But what you don't want to do is make a statement like this. You'll have a job here as long as you do your work. Because somebody will look at that and say, oh, that means that they're only going to terminate me for cause. And in order to show cause, there's a whole other step that you have to show. Think about a union contract, for example. If you have unionized employees, you probably have a clause in your contract that says they can only be terminated for cause. That's different in an at-will setting, but if you make a statement like this one in a job interview, you might find yourself with an employee who can only be terminated for cause. Somebody who can't be laid off, for example. Or, I don't like this statement either, if you meet your numbers each month, you can expect a bonus and a promotion. I like to be able to talk about a company's past performance. It's okay to say that. In the past, we have given bonuses under X, Y, and Z circumstances. This is what our bonus history has been for positions like yours. I can't guarantee you it'll be that way going forward. But I can tell you what it's been like in the past. Our hope is that we'll be able to do that. But again, it's all driven by the business. It's all driven by your individual performance. Those are the statements that you want to make. You don't want to make something that is that definitive, because if you do, somebody might come back to you later on and say, that's a promise you made, you didn't live up to it, and now I've got a contractual claim against you. So how do you avoid these pitfalls? I think a lot of the rules around interviewing are pretty simple, common sense steps that all of us, if I sit there and I tell you about these, it will become very obvious to you. Number one, identify what you really need to know. Again, keep in mind, you probably have 30 minutes, maybe an hour with your candidate. Maybe you take them out to lunch, maybe you take them out to dinner. But you have a limited amount of time to get the information that you really need to know. And if you start slipping backwards into casual conversation with this person, first of all, you're wasting your time. Second of all, you might end up stepping inadvertently into one of those protected categories about family status, marital status, plans for the future, even medical conditions, if you allow yourself to backslide too much. So identify what you really need to know. Before you sit down in that job interview, review the job description. Remember what it is that you're looking for. Think about those skills that are really needed to succeed. What intangibles are important for the job? Now, some of the jobs, if they're a little bit more blue collar, maybe there's not too many intangibles. But you may have a position that you're looking for initiative. Is this a sales position? If it's a manager, maybe that's important also. Creativity, independent judgment. Identify those things that you need to know, and you'll have a much better roadmap going into that 30 minutes or hour if you're lucky if you have it. Rule number 2, review the application very carefully. This is a hard one. I know what it's like. I've been in this situation many times. Find out at the last minute, I forgot, oh my gosh, I have an interview. And I've got to pull that resume out of my desk drawer and take a quick look at it before the candidate walks in the door. Highlight it. Write some notes in the margin about things that you want to ask. Be prepared. And I know this is not an easy one because on a very practical level, this is an annoying part of the day. It takes up time that is otherwise used driving the business forward. Again, we often walk into these situations unprepared. You'll be better prepared if you highlight a couple things that you want to talk about. And that way, again, you don't start backsliding into casual conversation that leads nowhere. Explore work achievements. Remember what I said at the beginning of this. There's often a lot of puffery that gets involved when people write their resumes. You might want to challenge those and get an idea of what this means. So you're looking at a manager who reduced overhead by 50%. Well, how did you do it? Ask those questions. Did you increase efficiency? Was it better management? Did you have 2 people and you lopped one off? That's a much easier way to get there, and I'm not so sure I'm as impressed by that. But people are very creative when they write their resumes. It's important to drill into the details on that. Look for gaps in the resume. We know to look at this. For example, I've got a guy that was an IT manager from 70 to 80, and all of a sudden he's the VP of Ops at XYZ Corp, 85 to the present. What happened during that 5-year hiatus? Were they traveling abroad? Was it a sabbatical? Were they doing time? Okay, now we're starting to get into some potentially protected categories. Uh-oh, you had a baby. This is where you might stumble into protected territory and you didn't even know you were doing it. Is it legitimate to ask about that gap in the resume? Absolutely. You have every right in the world to ask what happened during that 5-year gap. And now all of a sudden your candidate brought up an issue that is potentially protected territory. Remember, family status is something we've got to be careful with. So we have a rule about this one. What do you do if the candidate is the one that brings up a touchy subject? You didn't even do anything wrong. You have an exit strategy. First thing you do, change the subject. Remember, you're controlling this conversation. This is your time. This is your 30 minutes to an hour to find out everything you can about that candidate. And if you don't like where the conversation is going, redirect the conversation. For example, I'd love to talk more about your family, but we need to talk about you. And you will have candidates that will come in and do this even if you don't step on your toes and do that. Maybe they see a picture of your family on your desk, and they want to ask about your family, and all of a sudden they start talking about their family. It's okay to make a little bit of casual conversation, but redirect away from that. You don't want to waste much time. And again, if that candidate doesn't get hired, she, particularly if it's a she in this situation, might walk out of there and say, you know, that was a really odd interview. I went in there, I was all charged up to talk about all of my qualifications, and all he wanted to do was talk about my family. We sat in there for 30 minutes, and all he did was ask about my kids. I wonder if that's why I didn't get the job. And you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, you started that conversation. I'm not the one that even brought it up. Now we're in a he said, she said situation. Two people in a room, no other witnesses, people will write history in certain ways. The better way to avoid that type of problem is just redirect away from that conversation. Don't give somebody a reason to suspect that you've made a decision that was somehow based on one of those don't go there territories that I talked about. How else do you get out of that conversation? Punt it. How? I love HR. It's great to have an HR department because if they bring up something you really don't want to talk about, you kick it there. Let's not talk about your schizophrenia during this interview. Go talk to HR. You have a question about benefits. This happens a lot, by the way. Maybe not the schizophrenia, hopefully, but it can. People will often bring up during an interview the fact that they have diabetes, that they have high blood pressure, that maybe they're treating for cancer. I want to know more about your benefits program. All of a sudden you say, oh my gosh, the C word, cancer, can I talk about it? You really shouldn't during an interview. The better thing to do is just tell them we've got a great benefits program. Talk to HR afterwards. I'm happy to get you some information about it. Redirect back to where you need to go. This is an important one also. No leading questions. What do I mean by that? As a lawyer, again, we love asking leading questions. You think about lawyers you see on TV. They love asking leading questions, and the reason why they do that is because it gives the lawyer an opportunity to do the talking. Think about those situations. Isn't it true that? And the witness is only saying yes or no. It's the lawyer that's doing the talking. It's the lawyer that's telling the story. You don't want to do that in an interview situation. You're not there to tell the story. You want to hear their story. And if you ask leading questions, you're giving that candidate an opportunity to get an idea of what answer you want to hear. Remember, they're there to sell themselves to you. And so they're in a situation where they're saying to themselves, what is it that this guy wants to hear? And I'm going to try to tailor my answer around that. For example, this is a bad question to ask during an interview. This is a high-pressure, fast-paced environment. How do you handle stress? Haven't I just led that candidate right down the garden path? What is that guy going to say? I don't care what he thinks about stress. I know how he's going to answer it if he wants this job. He's going to tell me, I love stress. I can't get enough stress. I left my last job because it wasn't stressful enough. And we know none of this is true. But that's the type of answer you're going to get if you ask a leading question. The better thing to do is ask open-ended questions. I like this one. What was the most stressful part of your last job? All right, that's open-ended. That requires a description. That requires the candidate to tell a story. And when you listen to that story, you're going to get a good gauge, or a better gauge anyways, of how they handle stress, whether they can do it, and whether you think that they can fit within your environment. And you ask them, why? How did you deal with that stress? Well, I had to go see a shrink. Okay, let's move on. Some better than average questions. These are things that I like to ask in interviews, and I throw these out at you just as some ideas to get you thinking of ways to get the candidate talking. I think in an interview, you ought to spend about 20% of your time doing the talking, and a good 80% of it ought to be spent by that person telling you about themselves. Describe the best boss you've ever had. What achievements are you most proud of? You've got all these great things on your resume. It looks like you won a Nobel Peace Prize. What is it that you are most proud of having achieved to this point in your life? If you're interviewing a manager, this is a good one to ask. Tell me about a time when you had to communicate bad news. We don't like to have managers that are afraid to give bad news. And if you get a description here where the guy's throwing up in his garbage can because he's afraid to go tell somebody some bad news, I'm guessing that's not your candidate for a manager. Tell me about a project that really excited you. What really gets this person's juices flowing? Tell me about the best run company that you ever worked for. What made it run so well? Now, does this sound like your company, or does this sound exactly like the opposite of your company? You get an idea of cultural and personality fit when you ask your question like that. What makes it worthwhile for you to get up and go to work in the morning? I like asking questions like this because these are hard questions to be prepared for. You're going to get stuff you're going to get answers that are given on the fly, impromptu answers, as opposed to the sort of canned stuff that they might have been working with a headhunter with, or their friend, or their spouse, or whatever. When you ask a question like this, you're going to have them sort of cock their head at you and say, that's a good question. How do I answer that? And you've left it open-ended enough that they don't know exactly what it is that you're looking for, so you're more likely to get the truth. And that's obviously what we're trying to do here. I like situational questions. What would you do here? Maybe you had a sticky situation at work recently. Strip out some of the details, give that situation to them, see how they'd answer it. And if they'd answered it in exactly the opposite way that you would do it, again, you probably know this is not a candidate for you. If they come up with an idea that was better than yours, wow, now you've really found somebody that's a real gem, potentially. So these are good questions, I think, to ask because it gets them talking and it helps reveal information that you can't see just on the resume. Last rule, talk to each other. I always like having more than one interviewer if possible. I know some of our companies are probably too small to make this happen, but if you can do this, please do it, because you can't imagine how many times I've been through an interview process where I thought somebody was the best thing since sliced bread, and somebody else went out with the guy and he's picking his teeth with his fork at lunch, and it's incredibly revealing. Compare your experiences. You know, it's always good to get consensus on a candidate. Hopefully most people are moving in one direction and there's not a big controversy about them. Last thing I'll tell you about with that, be extremely careful with your interview notes. All right, if you're going to write things down on the resume or on the job application to remind you about the candidate, don't write things down about their personal experience, their skin color, all of those things that we talked about. I've seen all sorts of obnoxious things written down on notes. For example, he was so fat he could hardly fit in his suit. Her makeup made her look like a clown. These are actual things that I've seen, God forbid, lawyers actually write on interview notes. And I have to tell them, get rid of that and write things that are professional. Because guess what? If we don't hire one of those people and they want to come back and make a claim against us, those interview notes are going to become relevant and they're going to be discoverable in a piece of litigation. And if nothing else, I'm going to be embarrassed when that stuff gets shown to the jury. So, again, remember, have a plan. I know this is hard because I know you all have better things to do than interview people, but go into that interview with highlights on the resume or on the job application about things you want to talk about. Review it carefully so you're ready to go. Ask open-ended questions, always better than the other. If you're just going to ask a bunch of leading questions, you might as well just work off of the application itself. You're not really learning anything. Have an exit strategy. Again, sometimes you'll step in it, you didn't even realize that you were stepping in it. Compare notes with folks, and when in doubt, ask for help. If you have an HR department, that's always a good place to go. Certainly use the Better Business Bureau as a resource. And wow, look at that. With 1 minute to spare, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer anything. And I don't see any. I hope this was helpful for everyone. And I want to remind everybody that we have 2 more webinars coming up in this series. We have one on June 5th on termination. Let's hope that we don't have to deal with that because we've made the right hiring decisions. But we all know that every now and then the guy that you even thought was the best candidate on the planet turns out not to be that person. And so we will have a seminar to deal with termination tips, how to avoid litigation, how to make sure that you do that in a way that is dignified and as risk-free as possible. And then we will also do one on June 26th is the last one, and that's on social media and all the fun that gets involved with that. All right. So thanks for attending today. And if you have any other questions, you can direct them through the Better Business Bureau.
Okay, this is Bridget. I just wanted to thank you for joining us. I want to thank Jim for presenting for us. And I wanted to remind you that if you have anything to add, any suggestions, we're really happy with the way that the Flash webinars have been going, and we wanted to make sure that it's exactly what all of our businesses are looking for. So please feel free to drop me an email at bridget@cleveland.bbb.org, or you can respond to any of the emails I've been sending to you, and we'll make sure that we make these the best experience for everybody. So thank you for joining us.